Hello, and welcome to Environmental Laws, Thompson Hine's Environmental Law Podcast. In each episode, you'll hear from subject matter specialists at Thompson Hine and sometimes special guests on current events and hot-button issues in environmental law topics covering land, air, water, and safety. Laws. I am Tanya Nesbitt, a partner in Thompson Hine's Environmental, Product Liability, and Construction Practice Groups, and I reside in our Atlanta office. I am also a co-leader of the firm's Greenwashing Defense and Litigation team. While I regularly handle all types of environmental law, I specialize in environmental litigation. In today's episode, we'll be discussing regulating responsibility, the rise of EPR. EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility, is a policy approach that shifts the cost and responsibility of managing products at the end of their life from taxpayers and municipalities back to the companies that make them. From packaging and plastics to electronics and textiles, EPR laws are gaining momentum across the United States and globally. Today we'll explore how EPR works in practice, the legal and regulatory challenges it creates, and what it can mean for businesses navigating this changing landscape. Here to join me in this conversation is Gareth McDonald, Portfolio Director of Growth and Strategy at Worley Consulting. Gareth is a mechanical engineer at Worley Consulting and has worked in the industry for almost 25 years, moving everything from coal and household waste to cars and computers. He first got involved in waste recycling in the late 1990s, before it was a trend, and has been involved in many projects since, from design of packaging and recycling equipment to waste audits and energy from waste systems. Lately, a lot of his work has stepped outside of the technical and into the policy and procedures. Welcome, Gareth.
Thank you, Tanya.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about Worley Consulting?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we often say Worley is the biggest engineering firm that no one's ever heard of. We grew out of originally an oil and gas company. We're headquartered in Australia, and there's about 50,000 of us working on projects right now in energy transition all over the world. We're in about 40 different countries. The consulting part is a small part of that. There's around about 3,000 of us in consulting, and we have a range of different engineering and environmental disciplines. And we work on some really interesting projects. One of the real fun ones right now is we're working on a multi-billion-dollar direct air capture scheme in Texas. Anyway, I'm from our Vancouver office in British Columbia in Canada. We've got offices throughout Canada and the United States. So, yeah, there's a lot of us around.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating work you guys are doing. I know that your global perspective is going to be particularly helpful to today's conversation. So just to start us off, can you explain what extended producer responsibility means really in practical terms, and also give some examples of the kinds of products and industries that are going to be impacted by this policy approach?
The EPR regulations, as we see it today, really grew out of something that originated in Sweden in 1990. Really was first implemented in Germany in around about 1991. And, basically, it's a collection of policies and legislation that hold manufacturers to a responsibility for the end-of-life management of their product. And I think most of us are used to seeing that to a small degree when we may pay a deposit on drinks containers, right. We take them back and we get that deposit back. And that encourages return, encourages recycling. Some jurisdictions have separate waste collection for papers and cardboard packaging. Around the world now, that whole basis is increasingly being applied to a lot of other products, both in the industrial and domestic setting as well. Like I say, I mean, we think about end-of-life products being the obvious ones as drinks cans, paper, etc. But you mentioned earlier, textiles, electronics, right. Paints, batteries, plastics, these are all coming into it. And as we go through the 2020s, we're seeing new materials such as end-of-life EV batteries are increasingly coming into the waste stream. So the EPR regulations are really trying to manage how that is dealt with and ensure that the costs for that aren't put onto the end user or aren't put onto the local authority, wherever that may be.
Yeah, and in the US, we're seeing EPR for things even like tires as well, which is interesting. And so in the US, we have a number of states that have already enacted EPR laws, and some with laws still in the introductory phase. So
Yeah.
we're thinking of states like Minnesota and Oregon and California, to just name a few. But how do these EPR programs typically vary across states in terms of program design and things like enforcement and allocation of cost among producers?
Yeah, each different state, each different region, right now approaching enforcement differently. Most of them so far, but not all, require producers to sign up with a producer responsibility organization,
And
PRO.
but just
Yeah.
so we define
Yeah.
terms for the audience, because producer is a term of art. Who is a producer
It,
typically?
yeah, absolutely. A producer, really, under the regulations, is someone who manufactures and packs the product. There are other terminology that are used. We'll also use the term distributor.
Hmm.
That can be someone that brings a product in and then resells it, and that product may come from outside of the state, outside of the country, outside of the continent. As the first point of import, the distributor then has the responsibility under the EPR regulations. There's also a third category called brand owner. The brand owner is someone, totally outside of it. We'll take the example of say, McDonald's, where McDonald's are the actual brand. All of or the majority of the restaurants are franchises. So the brand owner does not have a direct input into the product. So they're not the distributor, they're not the manufacturer, but they're the brand that the public get to see. For example, it's the brand that would be advertising the toilet paper on
Right,
television, for example.
right.
So they're the three real definitions and the differences under EPR. I guess to that point, a little confusingly, the definition of a producer responsibility organization actually captures all three of those.
Right.
It's aimed at the manufacturer primarily, but again, if that manufacturer is offshore, then the distributor takes the responsibility for that. If it's a collection of diverse distributors, the brand owner, to a degree, has to take responsibility for compliance with the EPR regulations. But again, that varies dramatically state to state and province to province in Canada on how that's implemented.
Right, yes.
Which of course, which absolutely gives producers and brand owners a little bit of a headache when it comes
Sure.
to working out how to comply with it.
And each state is at times using different definitions for producer. And then there are some states where the law basically says somebody in the supply chain has to take the responsibility for this, and sort of allows perhaps the brand owner and the distributors to reach agreement as to who will be the registrant for purposes of complying with the law. I just want to turn to applicable exemptions, which also vary, right, from state to state. But what are typically some of the more popular exemptions that you're seeing applicable to producers in some of the industries that we've mentioned, like textiles and packaging? And
probably a little bit how you would expect that non-profit organizations, government agencies, charitable organizations right now are exempted from compliance. Typically, small businesses are exempt, and that's where we see quite a range in that. The common number picked across Canada and the US seems to be companies with a turnover of less than $2 million. But it does vary in some jurisdictions. It can be as low as $1 million. In
right.
others, we see it being $5 million. Other exemptions are things that are already covered by legislation. You mentioned tires earlier. In lots of jurisdictions, tires have been covered by an end of life regulation for a few years. Drinks containers generally exempt from this because they're covered by an existing regulation. I think we'll see over the years that all of these individual legislations and regulations will be rolled into an overarching EPR, which hopefully from a brand owner or producer's point of view will make it a little bit easier to
Yeah,
manage.
sure.
But I would think right now, I think that's an administrative challenge.
And I know that there are some exemptions based on, I know you mentioned revenue, but metric tonnage as well, and
Yes. Yeah.
particular containers used for long-term storage of particular types of durable products. And in some instances,
The
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, you're right. Generally, I think everyone's kind of agreed. I think that anyone that produces less than 1 ton waste per year is exempt. And the other key one of note, you mentioned the long-term storage, so the U-Haul boxes that you may buy and hang on the shelf in the garage for 5 years are exempt. But also most medical packaging and
Right,
medical waste and medication
right.
packaging is exempt from this
Yeah.
right now.
And
My
one of the things
opinion is that this will get rolled in over the
over
coming
time,
years, but yeah, right now,
right.
yeah.
And I know one of the things that people have found surprising is that a few of the laws also to require that the exemption has to be renewed. So it is not a one-time exemption and you're done. You may have to apply for a similar exemption in the subsequent years in the applicable jurisdiction. I wanted to
Yeah.
turn to talk a little bit about some of the implementation challenges. I know we've mentioned a few of them here that companies are facing with these newer laws. And obviously, I think you've talked about sort of the geography, right? Having so many different states approach this in different manners, right? The different definitions, different exemptions. What are some of the other challenges that producers are facing? I mean, I get a lot of questions about aftermarket sales from clients. I don't know
Yes.
if you've seen that too in your work.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yes. It's yeah, I mean, I think, you mentioned the geographical challenges, and I think if we look forward to the majority of states implementing this, each state that's implemented it so far does have just slightly different requirements. But I mean, part of it is administrative. Each state has their own producer responsibility
Yeah.
organization that you have to sign up with, you have to report to. So, if you imagine all 50 states get to this point, there's 50 different sets of reporting, there's 50 different payments, there's 50 different enforcement actions that could be taken
Right.
in there. You roll that into the different states so far have different labeling requirements on there. Now, I know in the US, there's always been the slight difference with Californian labeling to some other labeling. Taking that and rolling that across all states means, again, managing the production rates, then managing the distribution of the correctly labeled product or correctly packaged product to each state is a challenge. And then, you also mentioned the third party distribution. Under the rules right now, the manufacturer or the producer is responsible for the product, no matter where it ends up. So, if as a manufacturer you sell it to a distributor, they then distribute it across all 50 states. You can maybe contractually oblige the distributor to follow the rules, but
Right.
legally, as a manufacturer, you're held responsible for meeting that requirement. There's another challenge there. If we think maybe an electronic component manufacturer, every individual item that they sell, there could be multiple types of packaging. They may pack in bulk packaging where it's sold to another manufacturer for use in a product. It may get sold in a simple cardboard box packaging to a trade for repairs and replacements, and it may be in a nice glossy shiny shelf ready package to go on the wall in AutoZone or somewhere, so that the consumer will buy it. For each item, you've then got 3 different modes of packaging that you have to ensure complies with the EPR legislation. It's administratively, I think it's a challenge for most manufacturers.
And before we leave our discussion of the U.S., to add an additional challenge, we've seen in, I believe it was late July, there was a complaint filed in federal district court in Oregon regarding Oregon's Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act. And so there, a plaintiff it's the plaintiff is the National Association of Wholesaler Distributors, sued Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality Commission, and the Attorney General to halt implementation of the EPR law there and invalidate its implementing regulations. And so there, the trade association is basically complaining that the EPR, Oregon's EPR law unconstitutionally delegates authority to the PRO, or the Producer Responsibility Organization, which is the Circular Action Alliance. And the complaint then goes on to describe why that is basically unconstitutional in about 4 claims. But I think we're going to maybe see more litigation related to a number of state EPR laws that make similar delegations, perhaps. And so we'll have to see whether there are, any changes to come as a result of the litigation. It's still very, too early to tell how this might pan out.
Yeah, no, I think so, and I think, as I understand it, two of the big parts of this are that it's really anti-competitive. It's kind of geared towards the interest of producers within the jurisdiction of,
Right.
of action. So obviously, in this case, within Oregon. Also, I think there's a concern that there's potential lack of transparency in the regulation, which I think that one may be easier to deal with. But yeah, I know everybody is looking with incredible amounts of interest to see what
Sure.
happens. And I think, a while ago in Europe, there were some similar complaints. I don't know if they ever went as far as being a full legal challenge, but it did affect and it did amend the regulations as they were implemented over the last 20 or so years through Europe.
Well,
Yeah.
let's look at our neighbor to the north. So Canada has had a much longer track record with EPR than the United States, and we certainly at Thompson Hine represent a number of multinational clients in our environmental and ESG practices, and obviously get questions about this all the time. But how does Canada's national or provincial approach differ from what we're seeing in the United States currently?
It's a little different, but not significantly different. I mean, I'll say in Canada it's a little bit easier because obviously we have fewer provinces,
Sure.
and significantly less population. So, I think each province has, in a similar way to the way the states is organized, there's an overarching federal regulation, and then each province has their own legislation and they manage and implement that. They do have a little more track history, and there was a lot of industry engagement, I think, before the regulations were brought in. I think primarily British Columbia and Ontario have been the two key drivers in this, the main areas of population density and hence the main generators of the waste or so here. I think Ontario started EPR legislation in around about 2016, so coming up for 9 or 10 years of implementation. But again, it's somewhat similar. Each province needs the producers or the manufacturers to develop a stewardship plan to describe how they're going to manage collection and processing of end-of-life materials. Similarly to the way that Oregon were setting it up, the Canadian provinces recommend that producers either set up or establish or join producer responsibility organizations. Slightly different to the way that it's been set up in the States is that this is very much a manufacturer-led body. It is set up as a non-profit, but fully funded by the manufacturers, and it is more there to advocate and support the manufacturers in working this through. The province then has the overarching inspection and management and enforcement responsibility. Where in Oregon, my understanding is that the PRO would have some degree of enforcement and reporting responsibility. I was going to say, I think Ontario and BC are the two kind of strong ones here. The other provinces, I think, having probably a lower population density and more diverse geography are still coming along with it. I think November 2025 is the final implementation deadline. So we're seeing an increasing amount of activity in that space right now.
So for companies that obviously are operating in both the US and Canada, what would be sort of the main compliance complexities across the two regulatory schemes?
I think it's very similar to the way we spoke about it in the States. You know, the cross-border challenges are probably very similar to the cross-state line challenges. That, you know, each area is going to have a slightly different requirement. I think the Canadian provinces now are a little more harmonized in their approach. You know, you won't see a significantly different requirement in Ontario to, you know, say, Newfoundland, for example. And I think to a degree, I think people trading cross-border are probably already dealing with a kind of similar requirement, because there's the dual language requirement for packaging.
Right.
So there's already a separate packaging stream or a separate packaging design for a lot of materials. So you know, it's really an amendment to that to comply with the EPR legislation, rather than a wholesale change to something that, you know, had to deal with before. But I think the challenges are primarily the same. Right now, the majority of the PROs are province based. So, you know, a manufacturer, if they sell across Canada, will have to register with each of the provinces. They'll have to manage their distribution network across each of the provinces. It's likely the same challenges that we'll see as it gets rolled out across the states.
So if you had to pick a EPR model, and this could be a global example, what would be sort of the country or maybe even province that has gotten this right or is doing a good job, perhaps, and could serve as a model to influence policy here in North America?
That's a really good question. I think the oldest EPR regulations are probably approaching kind of 40 years old now, if from the early days in Germany. Looking at it as a consumer, I think if we look at some of the Scandinavian models that have been implemented, while I think they're incredibly good because they're very comprehensive, from a consumer point of view, they put an incredible amount of onus on the consumer for source separation. I think,
Okay.
I forget which country it is, maybe Sweden or Norway, but you know, each household has 9 separate segregated bins
Okay.
for source separation, and fairly, you know, robust procedures if you put the wrong material in the wrong bin at the wrong collection day. Which I think is probably a little bit too far, because it then turns people off from
Right.
the
It's too
whole
onerous.
concept
Yeah.
of yeah, it's too onerous. Again, partly from my knowledge of British Columbia's implementation, but also looking back, because British Columbia had a fairly robust series of regulations. You know, we spoke about tires, we spoke about drinks cans. They had robust regulations around cardboard and packaging and paper recycling and glass recycling and end of life electronics recycling for many years, probably for, you know, certainly as long as I've been in Canada, which is coming up for about 13 years, and certainly, you know, time before that. So they've done a very good job of starting to roll all of that up into one set of legislation. So I feel that's probably a good model. And then probably some of the other Western European countries, Germany, I think, is an extremely good model to follow, because their separation, their recycling of end of life materials, and not just packaging, but all kind of end-of-life materials, end-of-life goods, is incredibly high. I'm not going to quote a percentage right now for fear of getting it wrong, but
I understand.
it's,
Yeah.
you know, it's significantly more than any other country, and that in part is driven. I mean, that in a large part is driven by legislation, but is also driven by education, you know, public awareness campaigns of recycling, and what happens to the recycled materials as well. So, you know, it's not just a case of we put it in this trash can,
Right.
and then it goes away, and we don't ever need to think about it again. It's real awareness of what the impact is of that.
So as we look ahead, I know you talked a little bit about the expectation that perhaps some of these EPR policies will be sort of subsumed into an overarching policy, perhaps maybe
Yep.
at I mean, in the U.S. that would be at the federal level. But where do you see sort of EPR policy? Where do you see it heading in the next 5 years in North America? Do you think there'll be more emerging product categories, perhaps?
Absolutely, I think there will, and I think we mentioned again earlier that there's a whole new product category. I think with the majority of EVs, of early EVs coming up to that million-mile or 2 million-mile mark, and the batteries getting end of life batteries. There's a whole product category that when EPR was first thought about didn't exist as an end of life product. So that I think certainly is something that many jurisdictions are looking at right now. And then there's a range of other products that different jurisdictions are looking at. I know certain European ones, certain Canadian ones are looking at, for example, mattresses being brought
Okay.
into
Wow.
this. Mattresses are
Yeah.
notoriously difficult
Absolutely.
to deal with at the
Absolutely.
end of
And
life.
so
So
many end up in
you know,
landfills. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, and the sheer volume that an end of life mattress takes up is crazy. So I think we'll see that. Also, I think we talked about exemptions earlier. There are a number of exemptions around institutional, commercial sources of waste. I think as we see this coming over the coming years, those exemptions will be closed and reduced significantly. End of life electronics is another one of those strange areas where certain parts of it are regulated, certain parts of it are producer-led regulation. We see there's a producers right now buying back and dismantling and responsibly disposing or recycling of end of life white goods, for example. But I think there will be a consolidation of that into a more structured form as we see the coming years. But I think you're right. Right now in the United States, I think there's maybe a little pause while people look at the outcome of the challenge. From an advocate for this is maybe a little concerning.
You talked a little a bit earlier about sort of consumers sort of having an understanding of the end life of particular products. Do you
Yeah.
think EPR may play a major role in circular economy strategies or climate related goals?
I think it will. And again, coming back to the Canadian example, the EPR driven kind of collection agencies, and again, looking to BC, there's the agency, Return It BC agency. They do an extremely good job of advertising, of advocating for recycling across a wide range of products. So, from a consumer education point of view, I think they do a really good job. I think overall, in terms of a feed into circular economy strategies, maybe improving our climate change goals. It absolutely will. It's difficult to quantify. I think if you
Right.
look at some of the recycling schemes driven by EPR in isolation, it becomes challenging. I mean, if we think of the coffee cup from your local coffee bar that you drink and then gets recycled. The fibre from that coffee cup, may travel 2,000 miles before it ever gets back to you as being a coffee cup again. When you start to look at collection, driving it to a collection, or separating it from other waste, driving it to a processing facility, it gets turned into pulp, it gets driven to a manufacturing facility, it then gets manufactured, driven to a distribution warehouse, then driven back to the coffee shop. If you do the carbon intensity calculation on that, it's higher than just making it from fresh pulp. The whole concept of that is making manufacturers think a little bit more about, careful selection of products, careful selection of materials that can be recycled. So if you take individual pieces in isolation, it frequently doesn't add up. But if you look at it holistically, the benefits are tangible and certainly help us meet some of our circular economy goals.
So, what advice would you give businesses, especially those just starting to think about EPR and to prepare for what's coming? One thing that comes to mind for me is to look out for duplicative fees, right? So,
Yeah,
fees that may be reported by another entity in the supply chain, or fees on items that
yeah.
ultimately are being shipped out of state, and so their end of life is not within the state that has the particular EPR law. Are there any others that you would recommend for businesses just getting started?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my biggest one would be simplify, full stop. If you can reduce the number of different packaging types that your products are using, if you can use a simpler packaging, and this actually goes outside of the EPR part as well, but the overall simplification. I think if you look at the schedule of charges for that producers will have to pay TRO in Oregon, for example. I think
Hmm.
Oregon have published the schedule of charges. Um, the cost associated with your per ton per annum production of glossy cardboard or glossy or waxed cardboard packaging compared with a more simple model board packaging, you pay 10 times as much per ton into the recycling fee. So, you from a cost point of view, if you take the glossy cardboard out of your packaging, you can instantly, reduce the cost that you need to
Fees,
pay,
yeah,
annual cost to the PRO.
right.
Take that and multiply it by 50 if you sell into every state when the full set of EPR legislation is there. Add another 10 or 12 if you're selling into Canada as well. And, it's going to be a significant cost. The whole simplification thing also runs right through, coming back to my technical background, a simplified packaging system means, lower cost packaging equipment, lower energy utilization for that packaging equipment in most cases. Looking at, again, simplification of the packaging, reducing packaging sizes if possible. If we can get 10% more product into a container or into a truck, we take one vehicle off the road for every 10 that we dispatch. And the dispatcher, again, it's not a direct consequence of EPR, but we're reducing carbon emission by making that simpler or making it lighter. So I think that's one key. And engaging someone like yourself or someone like us to help look at the regulations across the different
Right.
jurisdictions is really helpful. Oh, I mean, nothing we do is unique. Someone, if they have time, if they have the people, can do it themselves. But for one or two packaging types, it's relatively straightforward. But I think for some of the bigger manufacturers, it becomes a huge
Bench
task
lift. Yeah.
to look at that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think unfortunately we're a little bit in. I'm not going to say the Wild West right now, but I think unfortunately there are so many nuances state to state and province to province still in Canada that it's going to take years, probably 5 years, for it to settle down and there be at least a harmonization of the main parts across the different jurisdictions. So, I think it's challenging right now.
I would agree. As
That's
we
a,
close, is there anything you think stakeholders, whether brands or regulators or consumers, often misunderstand about EPR?
I think there's a lot. I think brand owners, especially, maybe as distinct from manufacturers or producers, are still just looking at this as being another tax that they either need to pay out of their pocket or pass on to consumers as an increased cost.
Hmm.
I think because they are slightly removed from the production side of it, I think that they're missing the point that it's about that whole material selection where one decision made in the space of 30 minutes at the start of the product development can have a significant impact on the global environment, on whether we're going to put hundreds of tons of product in a landfill or whether it's going to be recyclable, and ultimately for the company whether it's going to be a cost. If you flick it round and look at it another way, I'm sure it would be a PR nightmare for any brand owner to see, when we we see the photographs of beaches in South Asia piled up with
Plastic,
refuse.
yeah, pollution.
It would have to be a nightmare for a brand owner to see their instantly recognizable packaging on that. Maybe that's a way to kind of shift their focus a little bit. That if we can get more recycling and less landfilling, you're less likely to have to deal with that PR issue in the future. And the other side of that coin as well is that I don't think consumers necessarily understand enough about products that can be recycled
Absolutely.
against those that actually are recycled. Yeah,
Yeah.
everyone knows that we can recycle aluminum drinks cans. Most people know that we can recycle plastic bottles, and that half of the bottles from one of the well-known brands that we buy have a significant recycled content in. But then I don't think people necessarily understand that thin wall yogurt pots are incredibly difficult to recycle
Sure.
because there's no cost benefit to it. Electrical items, end of life electrical items that can be repurposed or fully recycled, although there's the cost to it is a benefit. So I think we desperately need more public education, and that's globally. I think
Right.
I think Europe. Probably Europe and Japan, I think, are probably at the forefront of the consumer education, but I think still, I don't think we don't do enough. We don't tell enough people about it.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, or even sort of the modifications that may need to be made to a product to make it recyclable. So removing, plastic wrapping, for example.
Yeah.
Agreed. There's a deficit there in terms of where we need to be in terms of understanding how recycling works. But before
that's very
go ahead.
true. Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, we about the fact on food packaging that it's 95% fat free, and then maybe a little line at the bottom of the packaging in small typeface we say, oh, and this product is recyclable, this packaging is recyclable. Yeah. I'd rather see it the other way around, that we shouted about how recyclable our packaging was, or tell people if it isn't recyclable. Let the consumer make that choice.
Right. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add, Gareth, before we close?
I think it's this is one of those areas where crosses over, and I mean, Tanya, you obviously come from the legal standpoint. I come from the technical background. We have colleagues in the environmental teams who are heavily interested in that. We have consumer groups who are interested in it. It's one of these really interesting topics, and it's developing almost week by week right now.
Right.
The key point is that the legislation isn't going to go away, irrespective of the legal challenges. It may be amended, it may change,
Sure.
but it isn't going to go away. And over the coming years, it's going to get tighter and tighter. Does that mean it will take away any freedom of choice? No, I don't think it will. It will just push people into making different choices, right the way through from manufacturing to the consumer picking stuff off the shelves. But I mean, it's an exciting time to be engaged with this, and right now there's not enough people who fully understand it. And I think if we can grow the understanding in industry, we will see significant benefits. We'll reduce the size of landfills. We'll reduce carbon emissions. It's another little step on our way to reducing the effects of climate change, I think.
Well, Gareth, thank you so much for joining us. And this was a really interesting discussion. I learned a lot hearing your global perspective, really. So I appreciate your sharing your thoughts.
No, thank you, Tanya. I've really enjoyed it. And anytime you want to talk in the future, I'm happy to.
Appreciate that. Thank you for listening to Environmental Laws with Thompson Hine. I hope you found the information shared during today's program valuable. We welcome your questions about today's topic, as well as your suggestions for future programs. You can email me at tanya.nesbitt@thompsonhine.com. If you'd like to learn more about Thompson Hine's Environmental Group, please visit our website at thompsonhine.com. With over 400 lawyers and 10 offices, Thompson Hine is a full-service business law firm recognized for innovation in client service. Our Smart Path approach provides clients with services that are predictable, efficient, and aligned with their short and long-term strategic goals. This podcast is for informational purposes only. It provides general information and not legal advice or opinions regarding specific facts. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast without permission.